Hideo Kojima is always going to be associated with the Metal Gear series, there's just no denying that. It's been nearly 8 years since he worked on Metal Gear, yet it's still the first thing that comes to mind whenever he's brought up. However, before Metal Gear Solid blew up and made Kojima into an industry icon, he actually released two unrelated titles, 1988's Snatcher and 1994's Police Knots. While Police Knots has never been officially released outside Japan, Snatcher was actually given an English translation and ported to the Sega CD for release here in the States in 1995. However, the game flopped hard, with legend being that it sold only around 1,000 copies. Yet over the years, its reputation has grown considerably, and now it's considered to be not only one of Kojima's best games, but one of the greatest sci-fi stories the gaming medium has ever produced. Eager to fill in one of my blind spots, I finally decided to take the plunge and see what the hype was all about. Snatcher cast the player as Gillian Seed. Along with his wife Jamie, Gillian is suffering from amnesia, with the only word that keeps popping into his mind being Snatcher. So Gillian signs up with the Junker Agency in Neo-Kobe City, hoping that their work combating the titular Snatcher menace will somehow trigger his lost memories. So what exactly is a Snatcher, you ask? Well, they're basically replicants or Terminators that kill and then assume the identities of their victims. If you're a Fallout fan, that probably sounds familiar. Anyway, let me go ahead and address the elephant in the room, which is the gameplay. Now, nobody expects a game that originally released in 1988 to have aged the best, but it doesn't help that Snatcher is a graphic adventure game, which is a genre that already has limited appeal. In fact, even calling the bulk of what you do gameplay is being very generous, as you just have a number of commands on screen at any time that you have to choose from. It's not the most thrilling stuff, but let's be honest, if you're into sci-fi and cyberpunk, then you're probably a bit of a nerd who doesn't mind some light reading. My issue though is that a lot of it just boils down to picking all of your options multiple times until an event triggers for seemingly no reason. There are moments this method makes sense, like when you're waiting for an informant to contact you, and it's even used for a really funny gag when your turbo cycle is sabotaged and you have to resort to prayer. But usually it just feels like little more than trial and error. Like, did I really need to go over every inch of this study 9 times before the Snatchers decided to chuck a dead dog at me? The codec from Metal Gear is also basically brought over in the form of a video phone. As you'd expect, it's used at several points to advance the story, but you can also use it just to shed some light on Jamie and Gillian's relationship, and there's also a number of Easter eggs which can be accessed by using it. There is also the odd shooting section to break up the pace and provide a little bit of action. I imagine using a light gun as intended would make these more enjoyable, but as someone who was stuck emulating this, I had to use a controller. Most of them are relatively easy, but the final one against the insectoids near the end of the game proved to be a real pain in the balls. Seriously, I lost count of how many times I died, and at a certain point I just thought about looking up the ending on YouTube, but eventually I persevered as I finally realized I had infinite ammo and could just spam out bullets as fast as I could press the button. There are a few times when it all comes together and Snatcher does something really clever, like forcing you to find an advertisement for the black market so you can call and learn its location, or when you look around a room and see what appears to be a deactivated Snatcher, only to look back and see that it's vanished. And to its credit, the game avoids the inane logic puzzles that plague most adventure games. Somehow, Snatcher is far less obtuse than something like Grim Fandango, despite releasing a full decade earlier, but still I have to imagine that even its biggest fans would have to admit that the gameplay is really just a means to an end here. As is often the case with Kojima, it's the story that's the real star of the show here, and sweet baby Jesus, the Snatchers spin one hell of an epic yarn. The jump between the storytelling in the first Metal Gear and Snatcher is incredible considering they were only released about 17 months apart. Snake was practically a blank slate in Metal Gear, and the reveal of Big Boss being the mastermind behind Outer Heaven is the only real plot twist. Snatcher, on the other hand, is filled with characters who have actual personalities and motivations. Gillian might just look like a ripoff of Blade Runner's Deckard at first glance, but it quickly becomes apparent that he's not as dour and is much more of a lovable goofball. And I was genuinely invested in discovering the truth behind Gillian and Jamie's past. The game presents a really compelling mystery, and then the payoff is actually worth it. Like, trust me, as soon as I heard that Gillian had amnesia and an apparent connection to the Snatchers, I thought the same thing you probably are, but let me just say that the eventual reveal isn't nearly as obvious as it seems. Snatcher is also really the first time that Kojima's original ambitions as a filmmaker started to become apparent. It starts off with this epic opening where a badass sounding narrator fills you in on the outbreak of Lucifer Alpha and the emergence of the Snatchers, and it's backed by this highly cinematic presentation. Then you get this conversation between Gillian and Jamie before he's picked up by a turbo cycle and whisked away to Junker HQ. Just compare this opening to something like Final Fantasy VI, which released in 1994, and I mean no disrespect to Final Fantasy VI, as it's widely considered to be one of the greatest RPGs of all time, But in terms of presentation alone, this is like comparing the Great Train Robbery to Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Despite only interacting with it from a static first-person perspective, Neo Kobe City really does feel alive. Technology might quickly become dated, but art style and atmosphere are timeless, and that's something Snatcher possesses in spades. The anime-inspired visuals are still extremely eye-catching, and the way the game is able to convey different ambiences with just a few screens and sound effects is really a testament to all the artists who worked on it. Now, I'll admit that the voice acting here is the weakest link, as the cast can't really rise to the occasion when it comes to the big emotional moments. But the 90s was pretty much the Wild West when it comes to video game voice acting, and considering a lot of the growing pains at the time, I've actually got to commend Snatcher. Nobody here embarrasses themselves, and while a few performances are over the top, there's a certain charm to all of them, and it doesn't feel like anybody's just phoning it in. And it's balanced out by the soundtrack, which, as the kids would say, fucking slaps. I mean, one moment you're rocking out to the opening track Biohazard, and then the next you're bopping along to the jazzy swing of One Night in Neo Kobe City. Seriously, just pump this shit directly into my veins, it's so fucking good. What's also really notable about Snatcher, though, is the amount of Metal Gear Easter eggs packed into it. You've got the Outer Heaven nightclub, you can read Chief Cunningham's file and see that he used to work for Foxhound, and there's obviously your sidekick Metal Gear, who is even introduced with the theme of Terra. These are the kind of callbacks you'd expect from Kojima once he solidified himself as one of the industry's top stars, but to see that he was doing the same stuff in only his second game ever is wild. It's also just nice to think of a time when Kojima was so proud of Metal Gear that he couldn't help but sneak references to it into his projects. Now, I can't completely agree with a small yet vocal portion of his fan base who will tell you that Snatcher is the best game Kojima ever made, but now that I've played through it for myself, I can see where those people are coming from, and there is a part of me that wishes I could see the alternate timeline, where Snatcher turned out to be his breakthrough and Kojima gets locked into making sequels for it for the next 20 years. The universe he created here is compelling, and it's a complete shame he never got to return to it and flesh it out more. I give Snatcher 10.5 slices of Neo Kobe pizza out of 12.